What should be done about immigration policy? Obviously, this is sort of the elephant in the room.
It's really not the elephant in the room because everybody in Britain is talking about it.
Yeah.
Everybody is talking about it. You've got to you've got to repeal the Human Rights Act. You've got to change the judiciary so they're actually accountable. At the moment, we have a Supreme Court that was only invented in 2005. We had 1,000 years of the Lord Chancellor, who was a democratically appointed individual deciding who the senior judges were. Tony Blair changed all that. He created a Supreme Court. It's not accountable. You've got to change all that. You've got to make sure you've got a proper judiciary making proper decisions. You've got to get rid of these human rights excuses for allowing to stay in the country, because that is what is going on at the moment. And you just have to say no to more immigration.
You're saying that multiculturalism was not a success, and yet the importation of migrants from third world countries who hate the West just continued apace.
But this is all part of the absurd idea that's the way you balance the books. And that's driven by the Treasury, the Bank of England, all of their sort of people in the media. They're saying, if you cut migration, the British economy will go bust. I've got news for them. The British economy is going bust anyway. It's happening anyway. If you look at the rates of bonds, the bond price, it's much higher than when I was in office now. But nobody is creating a fuss about it because they've all bought into this model. They've all bought into the idea that net zero is going to give you more jobs, that migration is going to make everybody richer. That's obviously not true, but nobody wants to admit that they've got the last 40 years of policy so deeply wrong. And this is why the establishment is fighting back so viciously and fought back so viciously against what I said, because it would force them into a massive rethink. And it's the same, you can see the same thing going on in the United States with the attacks on Donald Trump's economic policies, because people don't want to admit that they got it so badly wrong.
Can there be a restoration of a true pride in what Great Britain was and should be in the middle of this bizarre sort of melange of multiculturalism that seems to have taken over London?
The views expressed, in the Olympic ceremony are not the views of the average Briton. The problem is we have an elite that hates Britain. And they have done for some time. And that is, the history of people like Jeremy Corbyn, Keir Starmer. They want to help the human rights of anybody who doesn't live in Britain, but they're very reticent about actually defending our own interests. We need to galvanise the people who are patriots in our country, but they have been neglected. They generally don't live in London. They live in small towns. They live in rural areas. And what is happening is the elite are trying to suppress those voices. I know people in Britain do want change. They voted for Brexit, even though the establishment told them it would be a disaster and it would be terrible for the British economy and no one would ever speak to us again. They voted for it because they want change. The problem has been that when politicians get into office, they get captured by this establishment bureaucracy. And I know, because I tried to go against it, that you get pretty harshly punished if you go for it. So what we've got to do is we've got to learn from Trump. He had the experience in his first term of having people in his administration that were disloyal. He had a media that was actively hostile. And what's happened in between is Project 2025 was built up, alternative media was built up to give the Trump campaign more momentum. And when he got into office, he had a plan of what to do. That is exactly what needs to happen in Britain. I mean, Keir Starmer was famously asked, which do you prefer, Westminster or the World Economic Forum? And he chose the World Economic Forum. I thought it was the most revelatory interview he's ever given, because he said it. He said it. He literally is batting for the Davos elite. I think that the winning coalition has to be people in Britain who are prepared to take on that establishment. I think there's an open question about whether Nigel Farage is actually prepared to do that. Or, does he just become another David Cameron who goes into office promising all sorts of things and doesn't deliver it? But the big message I want to get across to the British public is we have a problem, not just with politicians, but with the deep state, with the administrative state, with our establishment. And those are the people who also need to be challenged. And just, a lot of those institutions need to be dismantled because they're simply not working for Britain. I think the danger is that reform become part of the establishment. That's the British way, is to infiltrate and to sort of try and smooth things over. And any incoming prime minister, the civil service will say, "Oh yes, prime minister, we will get straight to it. We will action everything you say." And what you find out is they haven't actioned it, and a week later nothing's happened. So that the British approach, I mean, you've probably seen Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, is more manipulative than an outright ban. So I don't think we'd see an outright ban of reform. I think the danger is that these issues that have plagued Britain, certainly since the 1990s, but even way far back. It goes right back to the 1850s, the Northcote Rebellion, where the permanent bureaucracy was invented. These issues that have plagued our country for over a century need to be dealt with. And that's a discussion that I want to see the Conservative Party and the Reform Party having. And Donald Trump, by talking about the deep state, by talking about the swamp, he started explaining to people what was actually going wrong. And that discussion hasn't really happened yet in Britain, partly because we have an incredibly supine media that just feed off leaks from the bureaucracy. That's where they get all their information from, and they're completely part of the cabal.
Obviously, you've been out of government for a little while. What do you want to do next?
Well, I'm still very committed to getting the change we need in Britain. I believe the media is absolutely key. So I'm working on a new free speech media network to try and bring the type of energy that you're bringing in the United States to the UK and Europe. I think that's incredibly important. I think it's important we work with other conservative, other patriots across Europe and America. That's why I'm here at CPAC, because we all face the same battle against what is a very powerful international network. The Davos elite, the EU, all of these organizations. We even found out that USAID was funding Tony Blair. They were funding the Tony Blair Institute. So, they've been funding a lot of the Soros activity. So I think I'm interested in how we work together to take these forces on. People that believe in free speech, that believe in sovereignty, that believe in the family, that believe in patriotism. That's where the future lies, and that's what I'm working on.